Well, it is my honor to get to help join up the team in this great organization. And I find it especially interesting when I get fun email. I've gotten some really interesting email over the course of the 3.5+ years I've been here, and we've gotten quite a few email about our guest speaker tonight. I know you have a lot of questions. If you do, I want you to make sure you jot them down on your blue question cards. We'll take those about 7:30. So if you need a question card, you can raise it mid-program and we'll make sure we get you a question card. But I'm so excited that we have Congressman Schiff joining us, and it's my pleasure to introduce him officially tonight. Congressman Adam Schiff represents California's 28th Congressional District, and throughout his tenure has focused on growing the economy, bolstering national security, strengthening communities, improving education, safety, and health care for children. He serves as the chairman of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, overseeing the nation's intelligence agencies, including components of the Departments of Defense, Homeland Security, Justice, State, Treasury, and Energy. Congressman Schiff has also been a leader on national security and foreign policy efforts, and has pushed for broader strategy that emphasizes diplomacy, intelligence reform, and efforts to stabilize countries that are at risk of becoming future failed states and havens for terrorists. The Congressman has an impressive background, I know many of you know that, and experience in so many arenas. However, tonight we will focus our attention and our discussion on his New York Times bestselling book, Midnight in Washington, How We Almost Lost Our Democracy and Still Could. I hope every one of you got a book and you're going to go home and read it. This is a book where he details his accounts of the events of January 6, 2021, and the future of democracy in America. It's my privilege to welcome both to the podium my colleague Ronan O'Malley and Congressman Adam Schiff. Please welcome them both.
Well, it's great to see everyone, and thank you very much, Marianne, for that great welcome. And it's so nice to see a lot of familiar faces, and especially see a lot of new faces. It's great to finally be getting back to having in-person events, and we're truly honored to have Congressman Adam Schiff tonight. Thank you very much for coming. As I'm sure you can imagine, extremely busy individual. Earlier today, when I was on the phone with one of his staff members, his flight from LaGuardia was 2 hours late, which was messing up everything. He would have landed about 7. We were trying to change his flight. He actually had already gone ahead and changed his own flight to Newark and got everything switched to change. So thank you for all that you did just to even get here. As Marianne noted, the book, I think you all enjoy it. It highlights a good part of your career, but in particular it looks at the details of the Mueller investigation on Russia and the 2016 election, and in particular the first impeachment trial with regards to Ukraine. We are going to get into that, but I think all of you will really learn a lot from reading this book. I know I did. I knew a lot of the framework of it. To hear the details of it is really, sometimes it's heartening, but it is definitely informative. So we might just kind of look at kind of some of the broader, more international issues instead of the specifics of the impeachment. And if you do have questions about those, please go ahead and ask with those question cards. I think what's interesting, you mentioned in the book, you've been involved in the U.S. government for a long time. In your, as a young attorney, you were in the U.S. Attorney's Office in California. And long before you ever knew you were going to end up in Congress, you had your own exposure to the real threats and dangers of populism. Can you talk a little bit about what you learned from your time in what was then Czechoslovakia before it dissolved, and really what you saw as kind of the real dangers of demagoguery and kind of a populist leader willing to use xenophobia, villainizing minorities, and kind of taking advantage of economic strife to divide a country?
Certainly, and first of all, I want to thank you and the World Affairs Council for inviting me to join you. It's wonderful to be back in Houston. My folks used to live in the Woodlands for about 10 years. And actually, when I was in Eastern Europe, is when they chose to move and leave no forwarding address. We had been living in California, and I'll never forget calling home and my father saying that they were moving, and I was moving where? Well, moving to Texas, and It was quite a shock. I'm originally from Boston, and it was, I'll have you know, about a year and a half after they moved to Houston when I called their house and got the answering machine, and I'll be damned if my father's voice didn't have a drawl, which, you know, for a Bostonian, it was a kind of an amazing transformation. I went to Eastern Europe in 1992, and I was an assistant U.S. attorney in Los Angeles, and at the time, George Herbert Walker Bush was president. The attorney general was a former Pennsylvania Republican governor named Thornburg, and he made agreements with 3 attorney generals from the Eastern Bloc to send a senior prosecutor to each country as a consultant on criminal justice reform. And I was chosen to go to Czechoslovakia. And it was one of those times in my career where I couldn't believe I was getting paid to do what I was getting paid to do. And I was meeting with judges and parliamentarians and justices on the court and prison reformers and others. The wall had come down. Czechoslovakia now had all of these new property crimes because for the first time they had private property and they had a market. And so it was a fabulous experience to be there and to work with them and consult with them. But when I arrived, there was really very little talk of any potential separation of the Czech Republic and the Slovak Republic. And I remember, in fact, having a meeting with the Chief Justice of the Czechoslovak Supreme Court, a guy named Milan Holub, and asking him about it because I'd heard sort of a whisper campaign, and he was very dismissive. No, the Slovaks will never secede. I mean, why would they? They get more of the benefit of the Federal Republic than the Czechs, and yet within a matter of weeks, separation became all but inevitable. And I watched it happen, and it was just so striking. There was a Slovak nationalist, Vladimir Mečiar was his name, and he was a real skillful demagogue, and he played on the jealousy, rivalry between Czechs and Slovaks. He played on animosity towards Hungarian-speaking Slovaks, on prejudices against the Romani population, and the brand of xenophobic populism that he wielded like a club literally rent the country in a matter of months. And the country literally divided while I was there. And I was shocked to see how potent that was, and never imagined that I would see anything that would remind me of that back home. But it was one of those experiences that you have in life that at the time you're living it, you don't know is preparing you for something else. And it certainly taught me a lot about some of the roots of that kind of populism. When the wall came down and people suddenly had private property, and you also had sudden disparities in wealth. 2 high school friends, one who was a baker and one who taught English, made the same amount of money, which wasn't very much. But then all of a sudden, when Czechoslovakia opened up to the outside world, the skills of the English-speaking teacher to be a translator for business, the business world, became tremendously valued, and she was making 3 times, 5 times, 10 times what the baker was making. And the baker not only thought it was wrong, she thought it was criminal. I mean, why should this other person's skills be valued so much more? And it was a very fertile environment, that deep economic wrenching change. And I think a lot of the same changes that we've been experiencing through globalization and automation, in which millions of middle-class people have been suddenly at risk of losing everything, provided very fertile ground for the growth of the same kind of xenophobic populism here, but also that we've seen for the last decade all around the world.
And again, emblematic of the fact that you perhaps were cut out to be involved in American foreign policy or foreign policy oversight even before you're congressman. You're, I believe, the first federal prosecutor to join the FBI prosecuting Richard Miller, the first FBI agent indicted for spying for the FBI. And then later, when you're a very young, relatively new congressman, you get involved in the Intelligence Committee, and over time, obviously now you're the chairman of it. Can you, I think, if people are wondering in the book, one of the, I suppose, most notable statements, as you say, with regards to Iraq, that for you, that was the greatest, failure for you politically, you feel, with that the vote you made in favor of the Iraq War. But then a lot of ways for you, whether it's Republicans or Democrats, or even people within the Bush administration at the time, that they were perhaps dealing with flawed, or at least maybe intelligence that was leaning one way or the other instead of standing alone. Can you talk about the importance of intelligence to the United States and really the need to keep it as a tool to make policy instead of policy defining intelligence?
Certainly, and I was in my first term, 9 months in my first term when 9/11 took place, and I was leaving my apartment on the Hill when the planes struck the World Trade Center, and as I was walking towards the Capitol, people were just streaming through the streets away from the Capitol, and I heard an explosion in the distance, which was a secondary explosion at the Pentagon when the plane struck the Pentagon. And so, obviously the world changed very much that day for the whole country, but certainly changed for those of us in Congress. And in the wake of that, there was a profound concern over other potential attacks, and even worse, if those that were responsible for those kind of attacks got the most serious weapons, what might happen in the United States. And in the Bush administration, there was, I think, a desire among the vice president, if not the president, to finish the job that his father had started during the Gulf War. And I think that led some in the Bush administration to hype the intelligence as to whether Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction that they might give to people who would use them against us the way we had been attacked on 9/11. I was not on the Intelligence Committee at the time, and I can tell you it was very difficult for those of us not on the committee, and maybe even difficult for those who were, to be able to determine whether the intelligence was really good or not very good. How strong was the evidence that Iraq had an ongoing nuclear weapons program? And I remember being quite undecided about what to do up until very soon before we would have to vote on this. And being invited to the White House to discuss it with a number of the president's cabinet, and talking to George Tenet about the quality of the intelligence, which I had read, but really didn't have a background to fully assess. Because there are a number of different agencies within the intelligence community. Most of them were in agreement with each other, but some weren't. There were some that were dissenting, like the State Department, that had questions about whether the other intelligence agencies were getting it right or getting it wrong. And I remember during the meeting asking Tenet, and George Tenet, who was the CIA director at the time, he was a career professional. He had worked at the agency. I think he was both in Democratic and Republican administrations. And I asked him on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being absolutely certain that Iraq had an ongoing nuclear weapons program, and 1 being that it's purely speculative, what was his assessment of the intelligence of Iraq's ongoing nuclear weapons program? And he said he was a 10. Now, that was dead wrong. And yet, it was hard for me to discount what this career professional was telling us, or telling me. But it certainly, when I would learn later that Iraq did not have a nuclear weapons program, it showed me both the necessity of being deeply skeptical, of what we learn, of understanding the limitations of even the best intelligence, but even more to the point, how intelligence can be hyped or misused or politicized or pushed or misrepresented, and the tragic consequences of that. It was some years later that I was walking through the Capitol when the speaker stopped me and asked if she could talk with me, and I thought I was in trouble. And she said, no, it's all good. And she told me that the Intelligence Committee was beginning an investigation into the destruction of CIA interrogation tapes. And she thought it would be valuable to have somebody on the committee with investigative experience. Would I be interested in serving on the Intelligence Committee? And she said, you don't need to answer now, just think about it. And I said, I've thought about it. The answer is yes. And I became a member of the Intelligence Committee. And I have to tell you, though, that as tragic as the consequences of that, the hyping of that intelligence war, it would not be the last time I would see the abuse of intelligence, the hyping of intelligence, the distorting of intelligence, the misrepresentation of intelligence in the most astonishing ways that I've witnessed over the last 4 years. But that experience certainly brought home in a way that I think no other could the imperative of getting the intelligence right, but also understanding the limits of even the best intelligence.
And in the book you go through the congressional investigations with regards to Russia interference in the 2016 election, and obviously Robert Mueller's his own investigation. But at the end of the day, obviously the same conclusions are reached. All 17 U.S. intelligence agencies, now we have 18, that at the time reached the assertion that the Russians absolutely definitely did attempt to interfere in our election in 2016. But maybe the bigger issue, and I think sometimes it gets lost on people, maybe you can help define it. The Russians, and Putin in particular, he has no particular great love for Trump. It's just he perhaps thinks Trump would have been more malleable or someone he could work with better or work over better than Hillary Clinton. At the end of the day, isn't it really just that it's more important for Putin, more important for the Russians, and perhaps the Chinese down the line to kind of sow chaos in American elections, sow dissent and doubt in our democracy, and if we can weaken our democracies and our allies' democracies, French elections or the Brexit referendum in the UK, that then therefore the Russian politics don't look as bad. Isn't that perhaps maybe the biggest lesson to take from all of that? That past this election we just need to stay on guard?
I think it's certainly true that Putin isn't a Democrat, he's not a Republican. He could care less what party the President of the United States belongs to. But he does want someone that he believes will be advantageous to Russia in the Oval Office. And he also has the aim that you described, which is sowing discord between Americans and also causing Americans to distrust their own political system. He doesn't make any bones about Russia being a democracy. In Putin's worldview, there are no real democracies. There's just autocracy and hypocrisy. And so it's not about partisan politics for him. Nevertheless, when he sees a good thing, he knows it. And what he saw in Donald Trump was someone that would require little more than flattery to manipulate. People make out Putin to be some kind of a 10-foot-tall genius. You don't have to be a 10-foot-tall genius to figure out if you say something nice about Donald Trump, you can get him to do almost anything. And it's not as if you needed a magic ball to see that either. Donald Trump tells you that in innumerable ways. I was struck by a statement the former president made just a few months ago, which was very revealing along these lines, which is he was criticizing Facebook, which is deserving of a lot of criticism these days. But he made the observation in one of his statements that he basically should have shut down Facebook, and he would have, except Zuckerberg kept saying all these nice things about him. I marveled at this because why does he think that makes him look good? But in any event, it took about a nanosecond for Vladimir Putin to have Donald Trump's tune and to play him like a fiddle. Among other things, and this gets back to one of your question about I prosecuted this FBI agent who was seduced by a Russian KGB asset named Svetlana. For some reason, they're always named Svetlana. But he was an easy mark. I mean, he was a philanderer, he was greedy, he had no moral compass, and the Russians look for targets they can exploit, people of low character. And they look to dangle money or sex or whatever they think will appeal to someone to get them to do their bidding. And in the case of Donald Trump, among many other things, it has been his life's aspiration to build a Trump Tower in Moscow. And during the presidential campaign, although he was lying about it to the country and telling the country he had no business dealings in Russia, secretly he was trying to consummate this deal, which would have been the most lucrative of his life. And while he was telling the country I have no business dealings with Russia, his lawyer, Michael Cohen, was on the phone, literally on the phone with the Kremlin, to try to get Putin's help to build that tower. And of course, you're not going to build a tower in Moscow, let alone this tower, which was to be the tallest building, not just in Russia, but in all of Europe. You're not going to get permission to do that without Putin's approval. And when it was discovered, a year later, Donald Trump's now president of the United States, and it's discovered that he'd been trying to consummate this business deal in Moscow while lying about it to the country. He stopped on the White House grounds in front of Marine One helicopter, his hair unnaturally unmoved. And he's asked, "What about that, Mr. President? You said no business dealings with Russia, but you were trying to build this tower right up until practically the Republican convention." And for a guy who lied and dissembled so constantly as president, at times he could be very revealing, mostly when he didn't realize how damning what he was about to say really was. And in this case, he said, I might have lost the election. Why should I miss out on all those opportunities? In other words, he wasn't going to deny lying to the country, but his explanation was, why should I miss out? And I'm convinced that he still wants to build that tower. That throughout his presidency, he had very much the same attitude, which is, one day I may lose my reelection. I'd be a damn fool to criticize the guy that can make me all that money. With Richard Miller, the Russians had to offer him $50,000 worth of gold. They had to proactively offer him gold. With Donald Trump, he came to them. And so, yes, it's true. They don't care whether he's a Democrat or Republican. But the Russians are used to people like Donald Trump in Europe. Business people who become leaders of countries that they can entangle financially and manipulate. And I have to think that Putin couldn't believe his lucky stars. In fact, one of the things I mentioned during the impeachment trial, which I think both Republican and Democratic senators ended up laughing about, was at some point the president started blaming Ukraine for interfering in the 2016 election instead of Russia, which was, of course, a complete falsehood. But when he did, Putin made a statement saying, "Thank God the president is blaming the Ukrainians, not the Russians." And I remember making an observation to the senators, leave it to Donald Trump to make Vladimir Putin a religious man.
And to turn to the first impeachment trial, the one you led, obviously you weren't a manager for the second one related to the attack on the Capitol. I think sometimes it gets lost for people that it was truly dire states. We were talking about almost $400 million in defensive weaponry for the Ukrainians, Javelin anti-tank weapons. They were on an ongoing and still a simmering war with the Russians. Over 10,000 people have been killed on both sides, separatists and Ukrainians, nationalists. Can you talk about the fact that you discuss in the book at various times with Speaker Pelosi, amongst your colleagues, you all knew it was very unlikely you would ever be able to get to the 2/3 majority, 67 votes in the Senate, to actually remove the president. But why was it so important to still proceed with the impeachment?
It's a very good question. And during the course of the Russia investigation, I was not urging the impeachment of the president. A number of my colleagues were urging the impeachment of the president very early in the Trump administration. I wasn't one of them. And in fact, I wrote an op-ed that was published in the New York Times during the Mueller investigation that said the headline was "Democrats shouldn't take the bait on impeachment." And my feeling was that we needed to conclude our investigative work, and then we should decide what remedy was appropriate. And what made me a believer that impeachment was necessary, whether we could get a conviction or not, was the fact that when the Russia investigation came to a practical conclusion, and that is when Bob Mueller testified before the Congress, Donald Trump believed, because of the nature of his testimony, that he had escaped the jailer, that he escaped any accountability for his Russian misconduct. And by the way, lest you be confused by the no collusion, no obstruction mantra, let me just give you one single data point. Donald Trump's campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, was secretly meeting with an agent of Russian intelligence and giving Russian intelligence internal campaign polling data and their strategy for key battleground states, while that Russian intelligence agency was running a clandestine social media campaign to elect Donald Trump. So think about that when you hear people say no collusion, no obstruction. And imagine if that were the Clinton campaign and their campaign manager was meeting with Russian intelligence and giving them polling data while they were helping to elect Hillary Clinton. But it was the day after Bob Mueller testified, the very next day, when Donald Trump felt he had escaped accountability for his Russian misconduct, that he was on the phone with the president of Ukraine, seeking to get yet another country to help him cheat in yet another election. And when I saw that, when I learned that, what it told me was the lesson he learned by escaping any repercussion from his Russian misconduct was to engage in even more serious misconduct, that we could not allow him to escape accountability again. And the Ukraine misconduct was far more serious, because in the case of Russia, he was a candidate for office. And he couldn't compel Russia to do it. He could just invite them and ask them and try to coordinate with them, which he did. But in the case of Ukraine, he was now the president of the United States, and he could coerce them, which he tried to do by withholding hundreds of millions of dollars of military aid while they were fighting our adversary, the Russians. And as you were pointing out, Ukrainians were fighting and dying, and they were fighting and dying on the front line of really a fight for freedom. The Russians invaded their country. They're trying to remake the map of Europe by dint of military force, and our ally, this fledgling democracy, this flawed, imperfect, struggling democracy, was looking to us. And what are we doing? We are withholding military aid unless they help the president cheat. And I remember one of my colleagues made this point so beautifully. Sean Patrick Maloney, a colleague from New York. Bill Taylor was our charge d'affaires to Ukraine. Vietnam veteran, West Point graduate, incredible public servant. And he was testifying in the open hearing during the Ukraine hearings. And Sean demonstrated apparently that I didn't learn anything in law school, because I was taught in law school not to ask a question you don't know the answer to. But he showed that that's really bad advice. Sometimes you're really better off asking the question you don't know the answer to. And he asked Bill Taylor, where did you graduate at West Point? And Taylor's answer was high. And Maloney said, well, how high? And he said 5. Out of how many? 800. And Maloney said, if you graduated number 5 out of 500 West Point, you could probably pick what you wanted to do, but you chose to go to Vietnam. That's right. And you chose a combat battalion. That's right. And you fought and you received distinctions, did you? Yes, I did. And tell us what you earned. And he said, well, I got a Bronze Star, but I got this, I got that. But the most important one to me was the Combat Infantryman's Badge. And Maloney says, well, given your experience in combat, what was it like when you went to the front lines in Ukraine, where Ukrainians were fighting and dying every day? What was it like knowing that the United States was withholding military aid they needed to defend themselves because the president wanted to coerce them to help his campaign? How did you feel about that? And his answer was bad. And sometimes it's just a little exchange like that that says so much. People around the world, they look to us. They look to us, they know we're a very imperfect country, but they think that we represent something, we represent an idea, and there's nowhere else for them to turn. They're not going to turn to Russia, they're not going to turn to China, they're not going to turn to Europe with all its problems. Journalists in their prison cells in Turkey look to us. Political prisoners in Evin prison look to us. Those are the victims of extrajudicial killing in the Philippines look to us. All over the world, they look to us. And for the last several years, they haven't recognized what they see, which is a terrible tragedy for us, but a greater tragedy in many ways for them, because there's nowhere else for them to turn. And this is why what the president did vis-a-vis Ukraine was so destructive of that alliance, but so destructive of everything our country stands for. And you can draw a straight line between his escape of accountability over his Russian misconduct to Ukraine. You could draw a straight line from his escape of accountability over his Ukraine misconduct with his acquittal to new and even more destructive efforts to cheat and ultimately an armed insurrection against our own government. And if we were ever to be given a chance to govern again, where does that straight line lead? And this is one of the reasons I wrote this book, is, we've been living this, we've been in the middle of this, it's been an onslaught every day, and it's hard to see sometimes what's the bigger narrative arc of where we're headed as a country. And I think we all grew up in a generation after World War II where we thought that freedom was inexorable, that more people around the world were living in democracy and more people had a free press, and we thought it was somehow on autopilot. And then all of a sudden we've discovered there's nothing immutable about that. There's no law of nature that says that people need to live in democracy. That every generation apparently has to struggle and be reminded of the importance of freedom. And our generation is no different. And right now, things are very much at risk. I had lunch with two friends, husband and wife, mid-90s, both in the mid-90s. We should all be so lucky. And I said, have you ever seen anything like this? Yeah. And they said, we remember the Great Depression, we remember World War II, Korea and Vietnam, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Civil Rights Movement. We've never been more worried about the future of our country. Because through all of those prior periods of turmoil and tumult, we never doubted whether America would persevere. We never doubted whether our democracy would survive. But now we just don't know. Now I'm more optimistic than that. but I've never been more worried than I am today.
Obviously, Richard Nixon did not, go through the full impeachment process. He resigned before a trial, which we presume he would have been, convicted and removed from office anyway. But in the book, you note that perhaps if he had had the media that we have today, if he had Fox News or other, media outlets, and say it could apply to if we get a left-wing president later down the line, that the news structure we have today, that perhaps it's sadly an irony, kind of the opposite of what the founding fathers wanted. They wanted a free press to hold politicians accountable, but now it's gotten to the point where a free press and an organized press can become a rallying cry, become a focal point, can become a way to maintain your base, whether you're on the kind of far left or the far right. And the free press itself might be a reason you don't get impeached, a reason you don't get removed from office. Can you talk about the role of the media and how it's changed so much, especially say since Nixon?
I think this is one of the most difficult questions of all, and frankly, one of the most difficult challenges facing the country, which is that we don't get the same information as our neighbor anymore. I'm old enough to remember, and there are probably a few of you here that could say the same, Walter Cronkite's last broadcast. I was in college. I remember rushing back to my dormitory to watch. I don't know that I would rush back to my dormitory today to watch many people's last broadcast. I'd probably applaud if I did. But that was a time in which there was a large body of agreed upon fact, and we might differ on what to do with those facts, but at least we agreed that there was fact. Now there are entire information ecosystems that allow people to live in their own alternate factual world. And I obviously have my point of view. I don't think there is an equivalent to Fox and Newsmax and OAN. And those outlets, I'm convinced that if Nixon had them during Watergate, he would have never left office. Social media similarly uses algorithms that are designed to keep us on their platforms. That in and of itself is not an insidious purpose. They want to sell us advertising, so they want us to stay on their platform, so they show us what we want to see. And it's a revelation, I think, to most people over the age of, say, 25, that what I see in my newsfeed is not the same as what you see in your newsfeed. And I'll tell you, I've become, over the last several years, a human focus group. Everywhere I go, people give me their opinion, and not in very subtle ways. I get some of the most specific feedback when I'm in airports. And there's something about an airport where people know they're never going to see you again. And I will have people come up to me one right after the other. The first who will say, "Are you Adam Schiff? I just want to shake your hand. You're my hero." And the next will say, "Well, you're not my hero. You lie all the time. Why do you lie all the time? You should be ashamed of yourself. Your family should be ashamed of you. I think they are ashamed of you." And I listen to these two people, and I say, "I know what you're watching, and I know what you're watching." And it's not the same thing, because I'm the same person, and I can't be both those things. But that's where we are right now, and I don't have a good answer for how we get past this. Now, there are answers when it comes to social media. We can do away with the immunity that they enjoy if they're not going to moderate false content, false destructive content. Or if simpler, they're not willing to do away with algorithms that amplify for engagement, which means they amplify for anger and hatred and vitriol and violence, because that's what goes viral. But that's only part of the problem. We can't legislate away, what Fox Primetime says. The thought leader of the Republican Party right now is Tucker Carlson. He is the thought leader of that party. He is openly extolling the model of Viktor Orban, the wannabe dictator in Hungary. Conservative political organizations are hosting their political conventions in Budapest. There's nothing that can be done about that, except not to patronize that station. When the thought leaders of one of America's great parties are basically pushing an autocratic model, we are in dangerous, uncharted territory. It's not John McCain's party anymore. In my parents' generation, my mother was from a long line of Republicans. My mother's father was a delegate to Eisenhower. My father's from a long line of Democrats. There really wasn't any fighting in our household. There was a lot of common ground. But at this moment in time, it's a different Republican Party. And we need the Republican Party to return to being a party of ideas and ideology. But we also need to figure out how to be better consumers of information again, how to figure this problem out that we're getting different information from our neighbor. I think that this revolution in communication is every bit as significant as the invention of the printing press in terms of being just a disruptive impact on the information ecosystem. But with the printing press, civilization had centuries to get used to that innovation. We've had relative milliseconds to get used to the current information environment, but we better figure it out. Because otherwise we're just going to be tearing ourselves apart.
And lastly, before we turn to the audience questions, and we'll get to as many as we can, and I'm sure some of you asked similar questions. I might just combine them. You discuss in the book, at the core, what's facing America and the challenges facing America it's not Donald Trump, it's not somebody else. It's the reason a populist could get elected, the reason someone of that concerning could become the president of the United States, whether it's from the far right or from the far left, is because of what the nation's facing. Three people in the United States, Warren Buffett, Jeff Bezos, and Bill Gates, are worth as much as the bottom 50% of the United States. They are worth as much as 165 million Americans. Perhaps this infrastructure bill is a rare example of bipartisan working, but how do we address that core problem that whether it's now or 5 years from now, we can have a demagogue from the left as easily as we can have it from the right who promises everything somebody wants to hear, and that's because at the end of the day, tens of millions of Americans are desperate. They're feeling left behind. They're feeling they don't have a job. They're educated for them. What can we do to kind of lift up that part of America that feels America doesn't represent them anymore?
To me, these are the two central challenges. The one we just talked about in terms of how people get their information, and the other is the changing nature of our economy and the fact that through no fault of their own, millions and millions of Americans have lost their jobs, and others are at complete risk of falling out of the middle class or having no chance to become part of it. And I remember I was in Rhode Island speaking at one of the colleges and got into an Uber afterwards to go to the airport. And the woman driving the Uber said, "Oh, this is my lucky day." And before I had a chance to think that that was a positive reflection on my being in her Uber, she said, "I live near the airport and I can make some extra money taking you to the airport. I just got off work and I can make some extra money taking you to the airport." And I said, "It's interesting that you put it that way because you didn't really just get off work. You just got off one work and now you're starting another work." And I remember when I got out of her Uber thinking, I don't know what her day job pays or whether it has any benefits whatsoever, but her night job doesn't provide health care, doesn't have a retirement, then if her day job is like her night job, then eventually she's going to be in trouble. She's going to reach a certain point in her life when she has nothing saved for her retirement and is going to have to work till she drops, and even then, then what happens? How does she retire with any kind of dignity? And this is the truth of so many millions of people now who are working harder than ever, holding down 1 or 2 or 3 jobs and barely able to stay in their homes, and their kids are graduating from college, if they're lucky enough to go to college, often in debt, and there's no job for them, at least no job that's sufficient to pay their debt while they're earning a living and paying for their own place and their own food. And this, this isn't a new trend now. This is a trend that's been taking place over the last 2 or 3 decades, in which the middle class is finding it more and more difficult to survive. Working people are struggling at a shot at the American dream. And there are others who do super well. They're literally blasting off into space. And I'm not referring to Captain Kirk here, because I'm a Star Trek fan, but you can imagine how people feel who are really struggling to see that someone that may work hard also, but doesn't work as hard as they do, can blast off into space when they can barely pay the rent. And so this is, I think, when you find people ready for revolution, which is, people are most ready for revolution not when they have nothing, but when they have something they're at risk of losing. And I do think in 2016, people looked at the choice in the primary and the choice in the general, and in the primary, on the left, they had a choice of somebody who was promising a revolution, and on the right, they had someone promising to break everything. And when the person promising the revolution wasn't a choice anymore in the general election, many went with the one promising to break everything. And it wasn't an irrational choice for people who saw no prospect of a better future. They'd had a Clinton as president, they'd had a Bush as president. Their life hadn't improved, their circumstances hadn't improved, maybe their community was still dying. And they were ready to try a complete roll of the dice. Now, the guy they rolled the dice on did nothing for them. If anything, he stripped the country of the resources that might have been used to help them. But that fundamental economic challenge has not been sufficiently addressed by either party. And we better figure that out too. Now, I do think that what we have begun to do this session, first with the passage of the rescue plan, that lifted half the kids in poverty out of poverty, was hugely important. And just think about that for a minute. A single bill, not even a single bill, but a single provision of a single bill, lifted half the children in the country out of poverty. I mean, that should tell us a couple things. It should tell us, number one, it's not rocket science. It really wasn't complicated. We just increased the child tax credit. That's all that was necessary. Instead of focusing tax reform on what we did, the Republicans did a few years ago by a tax cut for very wealthy families and corporations, we focused a tax reform on lifting children out of poverty. So it should tell us that it's not rocket science, but it also should tell us that it's a policy decision. As a policy matter, we're deciding how many kids in America should live in poverty. So that bill, which not only did that, but also helps restaurants stay open and small businesses survive and people get vaccinated faster and people get fed and keep a roof over their head. That was just one bill. What we just passed last week, a bipartisan infrastructure bill that will help rebuild our roads and our highways, our electrical infrastructure, is also hugely consequential. Will produce lots of jobs. but also it means that we don't have the experience we've had all too often for the last 20 years of going to an airport, flying out of the country and landing in a far better airport than the one we left from, among other things. And if we get done what we will get done, what we must get done in the next couple of weeks, a third bill that invests in universal childhood, early childhood education, and childcare, quality childcare, and attacking climate change, and helping seniors on Medicare get the hearing aids they need, and 1,000 other things. The combination of those three things will be the biggest thing we've done since the New Deal to deal with the economic challenges that millions and millions of Americans face. And I view that as important in its own right, but I also view it as a key part of a democracy agenda, because at the end of the day, a democracy has to show it can deliver. And for too long, it hasn't delivered when it comes to these core challenges facing the country.
And if you'll all just maybe bear with us, we might go till say 8:10, 8:15, just try and get to as many audience questions as possible. I'll just maybe combine some that are related to each other. Related to the January 6th insurrection, Barb John asked, why has the investigation prosecution been so slow? And then related to that, Paulette similarly asks, why has our Justice Department not brought charges on Trump? And then maybe as a corollary to that, VJ asks, are there any new laws possible that could preclude a future president from resorting to what happened in the last few years to Trump?
Okay. I'll do my best but I may need help. I may have a Rick Perry moment where I can't remember the third thing. Why is it moving so slow? Why is the January 6th investigation moving so slow? I have to tell you, it's not moving slow. In the few months since we were established, we've interviewed over 150 people. That is lightning speed for the Congress of the United States. And when one of the witnesses completely refused to show up, Steve Bannon, it was days later we held him in criminal contempt. And days after that, we voted that contempt off the House floor and sent it to the Justice Department. Congress never moves that fast. Today we issued another slate of subpoenas. So I know it may seem like it's not moving fast, but we are actually moving very fast, and feel a real sense of urgency because there may be another attack on the Capitol. We want to do our work so that we can recommend to the country what needs to be done to protect our democracy going forward. Why isn't the Justice Department moving to prosecute Donald Trump? And I think there are sort of two questions here. Why isn't the Justice Department moving to prosecute Steve Bannon, who is the person who didn't show up? And then the question about the former president. In terms of Steve Bannon, in my view, what the Justice Department does or doesn't do will be an early test of whether our democracy is recovering. If we allow people to simply say when they get a subpoena to Congress, I'm not going, then basically Congress's oversight power is over. Our ability to be a co-equal branch of government is gone. The system of checks and balances is fundamentally altered. And we can't really say no one is above the law anymore. Because apparently, if you're connected enough, you can just refuse to show up. And you won't get prosecuted. Because I'll tell you, any one of you who got a congressional subpoena, or you got a subpoena to go to court, and you're like, nah, I don't think so, you would be under arrest by now. So I hope, and more than hope, I expect, the Justice Department will do its duty. Now, with respect to the former president, I'm less optimistic about whether the Justice Department will do what I think it should do. I think the Justice Department should investigate any credible allegation of criminal activity, whether it's the former president, former mayor, former senator, former dog catcher, it shouldn't matter. And in my view, where there is a tape recording of a president of the United States on the phone to a Secretary of State, telling that Secretary of State to find 11,780 votes that don't exist, and implying that he might be prosecuted if he doesn't. If any one of you had done that, you would be under investigation, if not indictment by now. And it may be that when you do the investigation and you determine how strong the evidence is and you weigh that evidence, you need to make a difficult decision. Is it in the best interest of the country to prosecute the former president, or is it not? A decision that Gerald Ford had to make about Richard Nixon. But you can't ignore the fact that crimes may have been committed. You can't decide that you're just, in the interest of not looking backward, not even going to investigate criminal activity. Because after the pardon of Nixon, and after the last 4 years in which the Justice Department took the position that you can't prosecute a sitting president, if we now take the position that you also can't prosecute a former president because that would be looking back, then basically the president is above the law. And that would be a terribly dangerous message to send any president. Finally, is there something being done to try to protect against what we saw the last 4 years? And by that, I mean, I think the questioner means the punishment of whistleblowers, the firing of inspector generals, the use of the Justice Department to protect the president's cronies, the use of the Justice Department to go after the president's enemies, the use of the White House grounds for political conventions, the use of the White House to enrich the president by renting out hotel rooms down the street to Saudis who don't show up, but because they don't really want the rooms. They want the favor. Yes, you've asked the right person that question. About a year ago, I approached the Speaker about putting together our own set of post-Watergate reforms. And over the last year, I've worked with the chairs of other committees to put together a bill called the Protecting Our Democracy Act, which would do all of these things. Protect the independence of the Justice Department, protect whistleblowers, inspector generals, strengthen the Hatch Acts, provide enforcement ability for the emoluments clause. The problem is I kept on having to add to the list. But we hope to take that up on the House floor later this month. And it will be an interesting test. It will be an interesting test because many of the components of the package had been authored by Republicans in the past. And given that we have a Democratic president, you would think that my Republican colleagues would want these protections against a Democratic president who might abuse their power. One of the most important provisions of that bill, by the way, is a provision that would expedite enforcement of congressional subpoenas. Now, you would think that if the Republicans believe they have a chance of taking back the Congress, they would want to be able to enforce their own subpoenas. But we will find out whether that institutional interest is outweighed by their fear of the former president. And we will find out soon enough. We hope to take that bill very soon.
And Congressman Schiff, I'm going to try to just get through these questions quickly so we get to as many of the audience questions as we can. Not trying to ask you to be brief, but just if we can get to a few of them. I know it's hard, it's difficult. These are huge issues. There's
There's 3 and 1. It's going to be brief.
I know. There are no short answers to some of these. But you mentioned obviously the integrity of elections and overall the importance of people being encouraged and not feeling shut out from elections. Michael asks, has the critical voting rights legislation been buried in Washington? And will an exception to the filibuster be carved out for voting rights?
I hope so. The short answer is I don't know. it will all depend really on Joe Manchin. Now, you know, I will say this. During the impeachment trial, I had the sense that if we could prove the president guilty and a danger, that Joe Manchin would vote to convict him, even though Donald Trump won his state by probably 30 points. And I have to tell you, that is not an easy ask of anyone. Donald Trump is more popular in West Virginia than he was in Utah. And in that respect, it was every bit as difficult a decision for Joe Manchin politically as it was for Mitt Romney. And I think every bit as courageous of him as it was of Mitt Romney. I think that we were able to prove it such that he could explain it back home. And I simply think that we have to demonstrate to Joe Manchin sufficiently that he can explain back home why voting rights are so essential that they have to take precedence over an archaic rule that was used in the past to protect another generation of Jim Crow laws. It shouldn't be that difficult a case to make, and what I'm hoping, although I can't tell you that I know this for a fact, but what I'm hoping is that the efforts that have been made over the last couple of weeks to take up voting rights that have shown that the Republican Party of Donald Trump is not willing to support voting rights. Indeed, its whole business model is based on disenfranchising people now. That the only way to protect voting rights is by creating a carve-out to the filibuster. And Mitch McConnell thought it was perfectly okay to carve out the appointment of conservative justices. It ought to be okay to carve out the protection of people's voting rights.
Just to pull from stuff that's in the immediate headlines, two related questions. Anne asks, does the recent revelation of the questioning of the Steele dossier cast a pall over findings on the Mueller report? And then they didn't put their name, but similarly someone asks, how is this fact changing the original case against former President Trump with the recent revelations?
With respect to the Mueller report, it doesn't change it at all because Bob Mueller didn't rely on the Steele dossier at all. And I'm glad that the question was asked because many people think that the Mueller report was somehow based on the Steele dossier, related to the Steele dossier. Mueller was very careful not to rely on the dossier at all. How does this affect the investigation overall? Not very much. Apparently, at least one individual, maybe more, lied to Christopher Steele when Christopher Steele put that dossier together. And then when they were interviewed by the FBI, they lied to the FBI. They've now been charged with the crime, and if they committed the crime, they should be sent to jail. And unlike other people who lied during the prior administration, they should not be pardoned. When Roger Stone lied to our committee and was convicted, he lied to cover up his interactions with the Russians, his effort to get information about when they were going to publish certain stolen emails through WikiLeaks. He was pardoned by Donald Trump for his participation in the cover-up. When Michael Flynn lied to the FBI to hide his conversation with the Russian ambassador to undermine U.S. sanctions on Russia over their cheating in the election, Bill Barr made the case go away. He pled guilty twice. And Bill Barr made the case go away. That should not happen, and it won't happen. You lie to the FBI, you should be prosecuted, and you should go to jail. But of course, none of that detracts at all from the fact that Donald Trump invited the Russians to try to help his campaign. They did help his campaign. He lied to cover it up. Doesn't undermine at all his corruption with respect to Ukraine or his incitement of the insurrection. But it has provided, I think, fodder for the Fox News prime time to try to say, don't pay attention to what Donald Trump did. Just pay attention to Christopher Steele. And, this gets back to the point of having an alternate reality that people can live in, where people can believe that somehow Donald Trump's misconduct is excused because people lied to Christopher Steele about a dossier that wasn't used by Bob Mueller.
Oh, just quickly, we'll just get to maybe 2 or 3 questions. And then, again, for all of you, I think my colleagues mentioned it, over half the books from tonight are actually already signed. So if you're in a hurry or you need to get going, kindly Congressman Schiff has already signed well over half of the books we have here this evening. If you would like to get it signed, some of them weren't signed yet. We have to get extra orders, which is a good sign. We have to order more books at the last minute. Congressman Schiff will be signing them afterwards. And then also, just if you all do me the favor, when we finish, if you can just remain seated, we just want to get him as quickly as we can to the table outside so he can sign the books for you all. So if you'll just remain seated and we'll walk him out the side. On a lighter note, Sophia asked a fun question. I always wonder why you never ran for Senate or even president. Would you consider running for president?
I don't know if that's a fun question. Well, right now, I will tell you, and you're probably following this here in Houston, I'm just waiting to see what my district looks like. We're going through reapportionment, so right now I'm just hoping there's a good district that I can run in, which, knock on wood, I think there is. But you're kind of asked the question. I have thought about running for the Senate. The last time we had a Senate seat open in California, I had just become the ranking Democrat on the Intelligence Committee and didn't want to leave that position. And I'm grateful that I didn't, because as it turned out, it was important for me to be there in ways I did not anticipate. And my strategy for the future is one that I learned as a kid when my father gave me some very good advice, which he has no recollection of ever giving me, which is kind of a terrifying thing because I have no idea what my kids are going to hold on to. But my dad told me that if you're good at what you do, there will always be a demand for you, which was a very liberating idea because then you just need to figure out how you could try to be good at something, and the rest would take care of itself. And so that's been my plan. I'm going to stick to it, and but I'm flattered by the question, and I thank you for it.
And just to promote ourselves, the council as well, I will remind you for another perspective on American foreign policy. In December 16th, we're hosting our very own local Houston congressman from the Texas 2nd District, former Navy SEAL and Congressman now Dan Crenshaw, for his perspective on American foreign policy and his time in the military. And related to,
and I'm sure if he were here, he would agree with everything I said.
And I will say, related to Russia, early next year, we're hosting Vladimir Kara-Murza. For those of you who may not be familiar with him, he is a Russian dissident and journalist who sadly has the unfortunate distinction of having been poisoned twice and luckily survived from the Russians. So we're looking forward to host that. And related to broader American policy, we're hosting former Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Joby Ward for his latest book and assessment on Syria. Just 2 quick questions to conclude. I love questions from our students and Archie, one of our great teachers out there from Lewiston South. Thank you so much for all the years that you brought great students to our events. Thank you, Archie. And 2 of Archie's students ask, Jenna and Lauren ask, what is your best advice for young people wanting to be in politics?
Well, I'm glad to get the question, and one of the things that has really left me optimistic about the future in some very difficult times is that notwithstanding how ugly the politics has been over the last few years, we've had some of the very best people run for office, I think, in the history of the Congress. And I think Lizzie Fletcher is one of them. I think she's phenomenal. And I think that in many ways, not unlike after 9/11 when people joined the service to protect the country, after the last several years, people decided they wanted to serve in a different way by running for office. And to the young people here, I would say we need you. We need you to do a better job than we've done. And one thing that I'm really encouraged by, that I see in my own kids, is the next generation has no patience for bigotry. They have no patience for what we're doing to our planet. They are impatient in the best sense of the word. And so I would just encourage you Yes, it's difficult and it can be ugly, but it's also hugely satisfying and rewarding. Just tonight, and Rona was kind to put up with me on the phone in the car, I was helping constituents who had come into this country on a visa, and then the pandemic hit, and they couldn't fly back home. And they applied to extend their visa and got no response. And now they were going to be deported and barred from coming into the country. And they were going to be put on a plane, and we were able to help. And we help veterans get the medicine that they need. We help people adopt children from other countries. For all the difficulties, it can be hugely wonderful and rewarding. And so I would just strongly encourage you, beg you, to pursue service. And it doesn't have to be an elective office. There are innumerable ways to serve in your local schools, as a teacher or a school board member, in medicine, in law. Don't try to do everything. And I say this to the people here, young and old alike. Don't try to do everything. Don't try to worry about everything. That way paralysis lies. This is a fragile moment for our democracy, but we're going to get through it. When you're in crisis, sometimes you can't see how it ends. Sometimes you can't even see if it's going to end. But it will end, and this too shall pass. But what we do in this moment will determine how quickly it passes. And we need everyone engaged. And so I think everyone needs to figure out over the next year, okay, what am I going to do to make a difference in the life of my community and my country? Young and old. That's the question we need to ask ourselves right now.
Lastly, again, we'll file out here on the side of the room if you all just wait for Congressman Schiff for that. But Nishan asked an excellent question to maybe conclude everything and get your final perspectives on the United States and where we go from here. Nishan asks, will the U.S. Remain the bastion of democracy and beacon of hope?
I have every confidence that it will. We are a deeply resilient country. And there are millions and millions of wonderful Americans in every state in the Union who love and cherish our legacy as a democracy. And so many more than those at the moment who are trying to tear it down. And so we will get through this and we will be a beacon again. And so, yes, we're going through a dark passage, but we will emerge on the other side. And let me just to conclude, thank you for moderating, and thank the World Affairs Council for hosting these kind of discussions. Thank you for being such a wonderful and civil audience. I know I'm not the least controversial guy in town, but it's wonderful that we can have a conversation like that, whether you agree with me or you don't, and that you're having Representative Crenshaw, and that you are hearing people with different points of view. At the end of the day, sometimes it's going to come down to whether we talk to each other, and so I think that the World Affairs Council plays an enormously important role, more important than ever. And finally, I want to say one thing about the World Affairs Council. For any of you who didn't get a book tonight because there were a bunch that were supposed to arrive that didn't, it isn't their fault. My apologies on behalf of the publisher. We will make sure that you do get the books, but I want you to know that it was through no lack of effort by the World Affairs Council. And thank you again for inviting me.
Thank you, Congressman. And thank you all for coming. And thank you again, Congressman Schiff, for your many years of service to the country and your continued